My name's Jessica Fizel. I'm an associate professor of political science at the University of New Mexico. I study American politics, political behavior, and political communication. Algorithms are generally designed to facilitate our attention on site. So algorithms are catered usually to our personal input, and they give us information that we have personally said that we like in the past by clicking or spending more attention on particular posts. And so when it comes to news media, that manifests usually in algorithms giving us more information that is consistent with the input that we have contributed in the past. So if we like a particular story about dolphins, it'll give us more stories about dolphins because the social media and general media sites make more money when we spend more time on site. So when it comes to political information in particular, algorithms are important because they tend to take the information that we put in and give us more of the same. So if we signal that we like Democratic or Republican leaning information, they give us a little bit more Democratic and Republican leaning information in order to keep our attention focused. And in some sense, this is great because it gives us information that we are interested in and we're learning. However, we also know that exposure to consistently like-minded political information leads to higher levels of political polarization. On the flip side, it also leads to higher levels of political participation, which in a democratic society is generally a great thing. However, we're participating with higher levels of polarization and animosity towards the out party. So the news information environment today is very different than it was when I was growing up, where there was broadcast media and there were 4 stations, and the 4 stations sent the same information out to everyone watching the nightly news. And the newspapers generated information that was tailored to a broad audience. With technological advances, we see the creation of cable and the proliferation of channels. On top of that, we see the creation of the internet and the further proliferation of options for information. So we can be really specific in the way that we seek out information, and we're exposed to abundant levels of information, which is wonderful if we're seeking out broad, informative, fact-based information. The main difference is that it used to be that these broadcast stations, these very serious journalists, were very good gatekeepers of information. So they would gatekeep information in a way that was making sure that the information the public received was fact-checked, was pretty objective, was honest, and was trustworthy. Today, we benefit from an abundant amount of information. However, the burden of that gatekeeping and fact-checking falls on the consumer. It falls on us. And the truth is that we're not the best at fact-checking information. We tend to believe the things that are consistent with our pre-existing viewpoints. We tend to trust information that feels good. And we very rarely really think about something feeling good as being perhaps dishonest and not trustworthy. So one of the biggest problems of social media is that it puts the burden of fact-checking information and vetting sources on the individual, which is a very difficult job to do in an environment where misinformation, disinformation, and severely framed information is abundant. So social media use, like any media use, is largely a function of what we seek out and what we pursue. So if you use social media for pro-civic, engaged things, we're going to be more engaged and participatory as a result. If we use social media, however, as an escape to avoid political information, which frankly the majority of people do, then we're going to be able to have an easier way out of being politically engaged and being politically informed. So some recent research by Marcus Pryor in his book, Post-Broadcast Democracy, finds that in an information environment where we have abundant choice of the things that we can consume, we're more likely to rely on our pre-existing political interest to determine what we choose. So people who are politically interested will choose more politically oriented information. People who are not politically interested are going to tune out entirely. And this manifests in downstream consequences, where people who are politically interested are more informed and more participatory, whereas people who are less politically interested are tuning out. They have lower levels of political knowledge, and they're less likely to vote. So framing is the way that we tell stories. And everyone can go to the same event and watch the exact same thing and tell the story of what happened differently. And news media is not, different in this way. The news media tell stories in ways that they think are most effective at, keeping people's attention and conveying the information that they need to convey. So there's a lot of research done on differences between episodic and thematic frames in news. So episodic framing is focusing on particular individuals and particular cases when telling a bigger story, whereas thematic frames are broader, contextualized, and often longitudinal in the story. So take the issue of homelessness, for example. If we're looking at the city of Albuquerque and thinking about homelessness, I can tell a story about homelessness and the unhoused population as the consequences of her personal choices. That's one story. I could also tell a thematic story about that, where we look at this person and put it in context of general trends for the city of Albuquerque and how unhoused rates for the city of Albuquerque compare with other cities of similar size. These two frames are extremely important in their consequences. People who watch episodically framed news stories tend to attribute responsibility for those problems to individuals, whereas people who watch thematically framed news stories tend to attribute responsibility for those issues to government and society. So when the news tends to focus, as they do, in very episodic and individualized stories, it leads us to perhaps misattribute responsibility for these major issues to individual choices. When in reality, if they told a broader, more comprehensive story about these important issues, we would realize that the blame and the responsibility for these important issues really lies on government and society. So I think in order to ensure that you're doing the best job that you can as a citizen learning about important issues is to read laterally and to try to find different stories about the same issue. So read, if you're thinking about local issues, read the Albuquerque Journal, read the source, read other different important sort of papers that are relevant to our local context. If we're thinking about national issues, read the New York Times, read the Wall Street Journal, go poke around some other sources and see what you can find to find different sort of frames of the same story. And then hopefully be reflective and thoughtful about the information that you're consuming so that we can really sort of check those gut level responses. Like, oh, this is right. I want more of this. Like, why do you feel that this is so right? Is that something that holds up to scrutiny? So it's really challenging to be discerning of information, especially online, with the technology available to create very easily misleading misinformation. However, there are some things that we can do as consumers to be on guard. The first thing I recommend is that you try to read laterally and read across a variety of sources. Read something that is, politically left, read something that's politically right to try to triangulate what the partisan framing of this is. If you read something and it seems kind of outrageous and outlandish, go to another source to see if they're also reporting that same story. Another thing we can do is rely on fact checkers. The fact checking industry is something that has really grown up with the internet to help us be able to quickly say, like, did a dolphin really, attack marine world or something like that? And you can actually fact check that information and see that it did not or it did. In a political context, you can very quickly fact check the speeches that politicians make, the debates that they've had to see whether or not the claims that they're stating are fact-based and backed up by evidence. When it comes to using the internet, always pay very careful attention to the URL Pay careful attention to the date. Pay careful attention to the photos and the images that you see. Try to make sure that the URL you're sourcing is actually legitimate and familiar. Try to make sure that the information that you're consuming is current. If it's a picture of, war outbreak or a big fire, double check the photography and double check the date on the story to make sure that that's actually recent, because things, float around and then resurface when similar stories arise. And then always try to make sure that the content feels accurate. Is this a joke? Is this politically motivated? If this poll that I'm reading about that says that, one candidate is really performing well seems surprising, well, what's the source of the poll? Is it something that was just done online on a, partisan news source and they're then publishing that same information? What's the sample size of a poll? How many people were actually surveyed? And how did they administer the survey? So all of these things are unfortunately what we have to do now to be confident in the information that we're consuming. So recent research by Joanna Dunaway and Kathleen Searles shows that when we consume news on our phone or mobile device, we are less likely to engage with that information, less likely to retain that information, and less likely to actually pay attention to the information that we're sitting there looking at. So if we increasingly rely on our phone for news and for information that we're trusting to sort of inform our democratic practices, we're not able to remember what it was that we originally read in the same level of detail as if we had watched a news segment on television or if we had read a full story in the newspaper. And so increasingly when people rely on mobile devices for information, not only are they not remembering enough, but they're also getting information that is largely pushed towards them through algorithmically generated sources. So information that tends to be consistent with their predispositions, echoing what they already thought and leading people to be more confident in their viewpoint rather than perhaps holding, their own ideas to some level of scrutiny so that they can be more balanced in the way that they understand the political world around them. So during the upcoming election cycle, if 2020 informs us of anything, we need to be very careful of social media campaigns to sow disinformation for political purposes. This comes from foreign sources and it comes from domestic sources and it comes from just your unintended, bad and malinformed comment from your aunt. So we need to be very careful about the political and partisan sort of nature of the information that's coming towards us. A lot of the information that's being shared through social media, online, around the election is going to be intended to move your attitudes and move your opinions about particular candidates and particular issues. And so be sensitive, I would say, to that motivation. Know that the information is not just generally intended to inform you, it's intended to inform you in a very specific way. The other thing that I would encourage people to remember always with social media, and especially young people, is that what we see on social media is not necessarily reflective of the reality. In a political context, when we go online, we tend to see a lot more very negative information. People say things online through the veil of anonymity that they would never say in person. And so what we might construct as what we think of the other party through information derived from online sources is going to be much more negative and much more hostile than our interpersonal interactions with people that are cross-partisan to us. So I would really encourage people to always just be thoughtful of the information that they're coming across, how it makes them feel. Like that gut check is really important. The way that we resonate with information is largely a cue about how we can think that this information is designed to affect us. If it makes you feel something, I always sort of throw a red flag. Are you angry? Stop. Are you fired up? Just stop and think about the motivation behind that information being shared with you. Where is it coming from and what is the intention? And also remember that the online version of ourselves is often very, very different than the interpersonal real life version. So, don't hold yourself to unrealistic standards in terms of beauty, but also in terms of politics. Sometimes what we see online is not truly representative of what people are. There's a lot more commonality among the American public than we will see online during the election. There's a book by Jamie Settle called Frenemies, which is one of the most wonderful books. I assigned it in my graduate level seminar on political communication. And one of the arguments that she makes is that social media enables this sort of engagement with politics that mixes news with our personal relationships and totally non-political information. And what we effectively do when we scroll through something like Facebook or something like Instagram is classify people. Because we have not only some knowledge of who they are personally, but we also see pictures of them in a boat or at a particular concert. And then we start to be able to overlay their political positions with their non-political life. And then we start to generalize that everybody with particular boats or particular sunglasses or at a particular concert is of a particular political orientation. And then we take this sort of practice classifying of non-political things informed by their personal relationship with us, and we take it into the real world, and we start thinking that truck, that Prius, that latte, that drink, right, is of a political orientation. So what that sort of translates into is that we take these online interactions where we're constantly sort of interacting with non-political, political content together into our interpersonal relationships, where we go up to someone and we say, oh, you're wearing those jeans, that shirt, and that, hairpiece, and you're clearly a Democrat or you're clearly a Republican before we even talk to them. And what that does is it sort of sets up these barriers and these walls with interpersonal discussions that are known to temper and to draw back that polarization and to make us less judgmental about the out party and less confident that our party is the right one. And if we can do that a little bit, I think it would really be beneficial for the discussions that we have, for the interactions that we have, for our family life, for our personal life. Because the truth is that the majority of Americans are not deeply politically engaged. The majority of Americans don't want to talk about politics. However, because it's become such a constant overlay to much of our online interaction, it seems that it's now this necessary overlay to all of our interpersonal relationships, which has really started to drive apart the parties and the people and the public and the community to detrimental levels. I think the biggest piece of advice that I would give to first-time voters, young people entering the political arena, is to be very thoughtful about the political information that you distribute. Pretend that your mom and your grandma and your future employer is going to find it in 30 years. You might feel like that is a brilliant idea right now, and those words might feel perfect right now, but is it going to sit right in 30 years when you're a grown adult with kids and a family and a job? Another piece of advice that I think is really important is to stay informed and stay on top of politics as much as you can without turning it into your whole life. An easy way to do this is to change the browser on your website from the Google page or whatever your landing page is to Apple News or Google News or a good aggregator of news information from local, national, and international perspectives.